Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a rather fragrant chapter of history. Imagine walking through a garden, the air rich with a scent of roses, jasmine, and sweet herbs, all blending together in a symphony of aromas. This isn't just any garden, it's the creation of a Persian king whose obsession with perfumed gardens was so profound that it became his life's mission. Imagine this: you're in ancient Persia, surrounded by lush greenery, with the soft hum of water flowing through fountains, and yes, you probably can't even imagine how a king could fall so deeply in love with a garden. But trust me, you won't be able to stop thinking about it, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from, so leave a comment with your local time and place. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with a Persian king, a ruler whose name is synonymous with luxury, nature, and art. He wasn't just any king, he was deeply captivated by the idea of creating a paradise on earth, a place where beauty, tranquility, and harmony met, and his obsession: perfumed gardens. You see, in ancient Persia, gardens were more than just patches of green, they were considered a glimpse of heaven on earth. They were designed not just for beauty, but to provide peace and reflect divine order. But for this king, it wasn't enough to simply have a garden. No, his vision was grander. He wanted the air to be thick with the sweet scent of flowers, the cool shade to embrace you like a long-lost friend, and the sights to be so beautiful that it almost felt unreal. As a young boy, he had heard stories of lush gardens in distant lands, ones that seemed to defy logic, places where nature and artistry came together in perfect unity. These stories planted a seed in his mind, and as he grew older, they bloomed into an obsession. And let me tell you, this king didn't just daydream, he took action. He ordered the creation of the most magnificent garden the world had ever seen, one that would make any garden today look like a child's playpen. The king's gardens were filled with roses from Damascus, lilies, cypress trees, and the fragrant blooms of jasmine and myrrh, each chosen with care for its beauty and its scent. But it wasn't just the flowers that made the garden so special. This garden had fountains. The fountains, they weren't just for decoration. They were a part of the garden's soul. Water was everything. It was symbolic of life, a flow of prosperity, and a calming sound that made you feel like you were in another world altogether. And let me throw in a fun fact for you. Did you know that the Persian word for garden, pairidaēza, actually means walled enclosure? So, when you walk into a Persian garden, it's like stepping into a mini paradise, walled off from the outside world, with the promise of peace and beauty. The Persian king, in his quest for perfection, made sure that every corner of his garden was in harmony. Paths were laid out meticulously, with flowers on either side, and trees provided cool shade during the hot summer months. But here's the thing: these gardens weren't just a luxury, they were a status symbol. A king who could build a garden like this wasn't just a ruler, he was a creator, an artist. These gardens spoke volumes about his power, his wealth, and his vision for a world where man and nature could coexist in perfect harmony. So, as we settle deeper into the story, remember this: the king didn't just want a garden, he wanted a sanctuary, a place that smelled like heaven and felt like paradise. And trust me, his obsession didn't stop there. As the years passed, the king's obsession with his gardens only deepened. He had already created one beautiful space, but that wasn't enough. Oh no, this wasn't a simple hobby or a passing phase for him. This was his life's work. He began dreaming bigger. His first garden was just a glimpse of what was to come. So, he decided to take it further, crafting a larger and even more elaborate garden to showcase the power of nature and his rule. The king's new vision was not just about personal indulgence. It was about building a legacy that would stand the test of time. Imagine the king walking through these gardens as if he owned the very earth beneath his feet, surrounded by the delicate fragrances of flowers he had handpicked from across the empire, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble walkways. Now, let's step back for a moment. Imagine you're in the king's shoes. Imagine the grandeur of his empire and the deep responsibility of ruling over such a vast land. To the king, these gardens weren't merely a retreat. They were a reflection of his power, an assertion that he controlled not just land and people, but the very essence of life itself. These gardens became symbolic of his reign, his control over nature, and his desire to shape the world according to his will. But here's the twist that no one ever expects. These gardens were also a way for him to cope with the stress of ruling. As every ruler knows, the weight of leadership can be incredibly heavy. So, when he stepped into his garden, it was like stepping into another world, a sanctuary of calm and beauty where time seemed to slow down. For the king, it was his personal escape from the chaos of palace politics and the demands of ruling an empire now. Speaking of this empire, here's an interesting tidbit you might not have known. The Persian Empire, during the time of this king, was one of the largest and most powerful in the world. It stretched from the vast deserts of Iran to the lush lands of Egypt, covering a huge variety of climates and environments. This meant that the king had access to a vast array of plants, flowers, and trees from all corners of the empire and from beyond. He didn't just rely on local flora. He brought in exotic species from places like India and even farther, ensuring his gardens were a showcase of the entire world's botanical wonders. This exotic collection wasn't just about aesthetics. No, it was much more than that. The king believed that each plant had its own unique power, its own essence. And so, he carefully selected plants not just for their beauty or fragrance, but for what they represented: life, prosperity, and divine favor. Each plant was like a token of nature's blessings. Now, here's where the fun part comes in. Remember how we talked about water being essential? Well, it wasn't just water from a fountain. The king designed intricate systems to bring water from distant rivers, ensuring his garden was always lush and full of life. In fact, the irrigation systems he used were so advanced for their time that some of them are still studied by engineers today. So, when the king stood in the middle of his garden, surrounded by towering cypress trees and vibrant roses, he wasn't just admiring the beauty, he was witnessing his vision of the perfect world come to life. And let's be honest, this sounds like a garden that would make even the most extravagant modern landscapers jealous, doesn't it? Now, here's something interesting for you. The Persian king was also a man of paradoxes. On the one hand, he loved luxury, beauty, and excess. But on the other hand, he was deeply philosophical, constantly pondering the nature of life and the universe. The garden became his philosophical playground, a space where he could reflect on life, nature, and his role as a ruler. The garden wasn't just an aesthetic pursuit. It was a form of intellectual and spiritual exploration for him. The more he worked on it, the more he came to believe that these gardens were a way for humanity to connect with the divine. Each petal, each leaf, was a symbol of the interconnectedness of all things. But not everything was as idyllic as it seemed. As with all grand projects, there were challenges. The king's obsession with perfection often led to frustration. He would spend hours inspecting the gardens, trying to perfect every detail, every curve of the fountain, every petal on the rose. There were moments of tension between him and his advisors, who grew tired of his endless pursuit of botanical perfection. But the king was undeterred. His vision was clear, and nothing, no matter how much time, money, or effort it took, could stop him from creating the perfect garden. He would continue, knowing that in these gardens he could escape the harsh realities of his royal life, even if just for a few fleeting moments. And so, the gardens grew, more flowers bloomed, more fountains flowed, and the king's obsession turned into a legacy. But, as you might guess, not everyone in the empire shared the same enthusiasm for these fragrant spaces. There were whispers among the people, some who thought the king had lost touch with the real world. They wondered if his obsession with his gardens had taken over his ability to rule effectively. The gardens became a symbol of the king's excesses and also a place where his critics could quietly voice their concerns. But the king, well, he simply didn't care. For him, the gardens were his legacy, his peace, and the one thing that truly brought him joy. And let me leave you with this thought. Some historians still debate whether the king's gardens were a true reflection of his greatness, or if they were an escape from the struggles of leadership. But one thing is certain. The gardens remain a testament to the king's vision of a world where nature and beauty could exist in perfect harmony. And as we move through this story, you'll see just how far that vision took him. The king's gardens were not only a retreat for him, but also a powerful statement. As the lush greenery flourished under his care, his power seemed to bloom with it. The empire, stretching across vast lands, became a patchwork of cultures, climates, and ideas. The gardens, much like the king's empire, were diverse, bringing together plants, flowers, and trees from the furthest corners of the world. But let's be real here, while the king was busy creating his perfect garden, his advisors were likely busy wondering when he was going to focus on ruling the empire more effectively. Still, these gardens, in their grandeur and elegance, held a deeper significance. For the king, they were more than just beautiful. They were a personal reflection of his wealth, wisdom, and spiritual connection to the world. Each plant, each blossom, held meaning. In fact, many of the plants were chosen for their symbolic value. The roses represented love and beauty, the jasmine signified purity, and the cypress tree stood for eternal life. As the king wandered through his vast estate, he often found solace in these symbols, finding deeper meaning in the way the gardens echoed his own personal philosophy. But there was one particular aspect of his garden that held even more significance for him: the fragrance. The king was obsessed with the power of scent. To him, the perfect fragrance wasn't just a luxury, it was an essential element of life, one that connected the physical world to the divine. As a ruler, he believed that scent was one of the most direct ways to connect with the gods. The sweet perfume of flowers became his ritual, his form of prayer. The air in his gardens, filled with a delicate scent of roses, lilies, and honeysuckle, wasn't just pleasant, it was sacred. The king would often walk through the gardens, inhaling deeply, as if each breath was a communion with something greater than himself. But of course, the gardens weren't just an act of personal spirituality. They were also a tool of political power. By building such elaborate and lavish gardens, the king sent a message to both his people and his enemies. It wasn't just about luxury, it was about control. The king wanted to show the world that he could shape nature itself to reflect his grandeur. The gardens were, in a sense, his personal propaganda. Every rosebush, every fountain, every pathway was a reminder that he ruled not only over men but over nature as well. However, as with all great ambitions, there were costs. The king's obsession with perfection, with crafting a paradise on earth, took a toll. His time, which could have been spent on matters of state, was consumed by the meticulous care of his garden. He became increasingly isolated from the affairs of his empire, retreating more and more into his fragrant world. The empire, while still large and powerful, began to suffer from his neglect. The people, once inspired by his grand vision, started to whisper among themselves. Was the king's obsession with gardens blinding him to the real needs of the empire? Some of his advisors began to question whether he had forgotten the balance between ruler and gardener. The empire was vast, and, while gardens were a beautiful symbol of power, the king's attention to them may have overshadowed the more pressing issues at hand. The people's needs were growing, but they couldn't help but feel the king's mind was elsewhere. And this is where the story takes a turn. As the years passed and the king's health began to decline, his obsession with the gardens only deepened. The gardens became not just a sanctuary, but a symbol of his immortality. He could create beauty and perfection within his kingdom, but could he control the passage of time itself? Could he prevent death from taking him as it had taken so many before him? Some say he thought his garden could provide the answers. The lush, fragrant flowers were more than just a retreat. They were a way to cling to life, to avoid the inevitable decay of age. But there was something else lurking in the king's heart of fear. Fear that his great gardens, his great creations, might not be enough to preserve his legacy. History was full of kings who had left behind impressive monuments, but how many of them were truly remembered by the generations that followed? The king knew that time was cruel, and it wouldn't be long before even his perfect gardens would be forgotten, overtaken by the winds of change. The king's fear of being forgotten led him to a decision that would forever change the course of his life. Rather than focusing on the practical matters of ruling his empire, he decided to embark on a journey of personal discovery. He believed that if he could unlock the secrets of nature, if he could understand the very essence of life through his gardens, he might find a way to achieve eternal life. In a way, he was looking for immortality, not in his deeds, but in his connection to the earth, to the flowers that bloomed at his command. Historians still debate whether the king's obsession with the gardens was an expression of his spiritual devotion or a reflection of his fear of death. Some argue that he was simply trying to escape from the reality of old age, while others believe he genuinely sought a connection to the divine through nature. Either way, his gardens became his most significant legacy. They weren't just about beauty or power. They were about finding meaning in a world that was, in the end, fleeting. And even though the king's reign eventually ended, his gardens remained. As centuries passed, the fragrance of his flowers faded, and the marble fountains cracked under the weight of time. But the story of the king and his gardens lived on, passed down through generations as a symbol of ambition, beauty, and the search for eternal life. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, somewhere in the distant future, someone will walk through those same gardens, breathe in the fragrance, and feel the connection to a king long gone. As the years moved on, the king's gardens continued to be a focal point for his legacy, though they also became a bittersweet reminder of time's inevitable march. By now, the gardens were not only a masterpiece but a symbol of a king's attempt to conquer the one thing he could not control, his mortality. The flowers, trees, and fountains all remained standing, but the king himself, who had poured his soul into their creation, was gone. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. You see, rumors spread like wildfire through the empire that the king's obsession with his gardens didn't end at death. It was said that even in his final days, he tried to infuse the earth with his very essence, hoping it would keep his memory alive for eternity. Some even whispered that, as he lay on his deathbed, the fragrance of jasmine and roses wafted into his chambers, a final breath of life within his gardens. But, despite these legends, the king's physical presence was no longer felt. However, his creation, the gardens, became something entirely different. They weren't just about him anymore. They became an idea, an embodiment of his vision, one that persisted long after his death. And here's where things get really fascinating. The gardens continued to evolve after his reign ended. As other rulers came and went, the gardens were passed down, transformed, and even expanded upon. Some kings added their own touches, introducing new plants, building grander fountains, and adjusting the layout. It's almost as if the gardens, when themselves, had taken on a life of their own, growing and changing in a way that echoed the natural world's ever-changing nature. However, despite the gardens being continually reimagined, the essence of the king's original vision remained. People who visited these gardens still spoke in awe of the serenity, the harmony, and the profound beauty they offered. And so, the legacy of the king continued, albeit in a form that was different from what he had initially envisioned. His gardens were no longer just a personal retreat or an extension of his royal power. They became a cultural treasure, a living testament to the Persian Empire's artistic and philosophical grandeur. Historians would later note that these gardens played a pivotal role in the development of the Persian garden tradition, influencing garden design across the world, including the gardens of the Mughal Empire in India and the famous gardens of Andalusia in Spain. The king's obsession with creating a perfect paradise became the foundation for an entire cultural movement that celebrated the intersection of nature, art, and spirituality. Yet, as with all things in history, the passage of time eventually took its toll. As centuries went by, the gardens began to show signs of earthquakes, invasions, and the inevitable ravages of time wore down the marble fountains, cracked the stone pathways, and caused the once pristine flowers to fade into memory. But even as the physical structures of the gardens deteriorated, something intangible remained. The very idea of the gardens, what they represented, continued to live on. The spirit of the king's vision, the deep yearning to create something that transcended time, continued to inspire those who knew the story. And while no one could walk the original paths of the garden as the king once did, there were always those who tried to recreate his paradise. Over time, the influence of these gardens spread, and the idea of creating spaces where nature, beauty, and the divine could coexist became an essential part of many cultures. But even in its ruins, the garden's impact was undeniable. It had become more than just a place. It had become an idea that lived on in the hearts and minds of those who saw in it not just a garden, but a reminder that beauty, like life itself, is fleeting. So here's the part that still fascinates historians to this day. Some believe that the king's obsession with his gardens, his desire to craft the perfect sanctuary, was an attempt to capture something that transcended his earthly reign. Perhaps the gardens were his way of confronting the ultimate truth that, no matter how grand your legacy, no matter how beautiful your creation, everything must eventually return to the earth. The king's gardens were never just about him or his empire, they were about something much larger, the beauty of impermanence. Even in their decay, the gardens symbolized the king's eternal connection to nature. The flowers that once bloomed, the fountains that once sang with water, they were all part of a cycle that would one day begin anew, as life and death always do. Historians still debate whether the king's obsession with his gardens was truly a symbol of his greatness, or simply a grand escape from the inevitable passage of time. Was he trying to immortalize his empire, or was he simply trying to make peace with the reality that even the greatest rulers are not exempt from the laws of nature? Some argue that his gardens were an expression of vanity, a way for him to defy the very thing that every human must face. Others, however, see them as a profound testament to the king's wisdom and understanding of the world's impermanence. Regardless of where you fall in this debate, one thing is clear: the king's gardens have remained in history as an enduring symbol of beauty, resilience, and the human desire to transcend the ordinary. The gardens, like the king, may have faded with time, but their legacy has lived on through the generations. And as we sit here, remembering his story, we find ourselves inspired by the very idea he sought to create an enduring paradise that, in the end, it is more about the journey than the destination. Now, as you imagine these gardens slowly fading into the mist of history, remember this: the king may have built them, but it is the world that continues to nourish their memory, and, just like his gardens, the stories we share and the beauty we create will leave behind their own kind of legacy, one that endures long after we're gone. The story of the king's gardens, beautiful and tragic in its own way, reminds us of something deeper: the tension between creation and decay, between immortality and the fleeting nature of existence. Even as the physical space of the garden deteriorated, it continued to live on in the hearts and minds of those who came after him. In the ruins of what had once been a paradise, there remained an undeniable truth: this garden, much like the king's reign, was an imperfect masterpiece, a work of art subject to time's unyielding force. But as we all know, beauty can still be found in imperfection. And this is perhaps the most important lesson the king's story imparts. As the centuries passed, the garden was no longer just the creation of one man. It became a symbol, an idea of paradise, a dream that people from various walks of life could strive for. The influence of the Persian gardens spread far beyond the empire's borders, influencing rulers in far-off lands who saw the king's work as the epitome of splendor. It inspired the Mughal emperors to build the Taj Mahal's breathtaking gardens, and later, even European landscapers took cues from the Persian style, designing gardens with geometric precision, fountains, and intricate plantings. Yet, in the midst of all this expansion, the king's original garden faded, his influence stretching through time and space, even as the flowers in his paradise slowly withered away. But let's pause here for a moment. When we think of the king's gardens today, what do we really remember? It's not just the flowers, or the fountains, or even the sense of peace that pervaded the place. What endures is the king's vision, a vision of something more than just nature. It's about the idea that we, as humans, have the capacity to create something that reflects the divine, that mirrors the beauty and harmony of the natural world. It's about the realization that we can shape our environment, our lives, to reflect the ideals we hold dear. This vision was never about perfection, it was about striving to create a space where beauty, peace, and nature could intertwine. The king, in his pursuit of this dream, was not just an emperor with power over his people. He was a visionary, an artist, and above all, a man who understood that beauty, in all its forms, is worth a struggle even when it's fleeting. And here's the part of the story where I think we can all relate to the king's obsession. Sometimes it's not about what we achieve that matters. It's about the act of creation itself, the process of giving life to something that might not last forever, but will still matter while it does. The king's gardens weren't perfect. They weren't meant to be. They were his effort to connect to something greater than himself, and in that connection, he found purpose. Even as the seasons passed and the gardens began to fade, the king's soul, his obsession with beauty, remained etched in the very fabric of the empire. But of course, with all great things, there comes an inevitable change. The gardens, as grand as they were, couldn't escape the passage of time. As empires rose and fell, as wars were fought and lost, the once pristine gardens of the Persian king began to lose their luster. The marble fountains cracked, the flowers became fewer, and the air grew thick with the dust of history. Yet, in the quiet corners of the empire, there were still those who visited the gardens, those who saw beyond the decay, who understood that there was something more here than just an old ruin. In fact, some of the most interesting accounts of the garden's later years come from travelers who ventured through the ancient ruins, looking for clues about the past. They described a place that was no longer a flourishing paradise but still carried a sense of magic, a lingering presence of the king's original vision. To those who visited, the gardens spoke of a time long past, the time when the king had breathed life into the earth itself. The very stones seemed to whisper his name, reminding those who wandered through the remnants of his creation that there had once been something extraordinary here. But what about the king's legacy? Did it survive the erosion of time? Historians still debate that question. Some argue that the king's gardens were his greatest achievement, while others contend that his obsession with them overshadowed his role as a ruler. Perhaps there's truth to both sides. The gardens, like the king's reign, were beautiful but flawed, and in their imperfection, they became a testament to the complexity of human desire. The king wanted to leave behind something eternal, but in the end, he was reminded of nature's power over all things, even the most magnificent of empires. One thing is certain: the king's pursuit of beauty, peace, and harmony in nature left an indelible mark on the world. His gardens, even in ruin, continue to inspire, reminding us that our efforts to create beauty, even if temporary, can transcend time and influence those who come after us. And that's the true legacy of the king, not the flowers or the fountains, but the idea that beauty, in all its forms, is worth the pursuit, even when we know it won't last forever. So, as you lie back and let this story sink in, remember this: in the end, it's not the gardens themselves that endure, but the vision behind them. The king's obsession with his gardens, his unwavering desire to create a paradise on earth, lives on in every space we try to shape and in every effort to leave something beautiful behind. And just like that, we find a piece of immortality, not in the things we build, but in the way we strive for them. Now, as the night deepens, let's let the echoes of the king's story fade into the quiet, like the soft hum of a fountain, long silent. And though his gardens are gone, his dream remains. A dream we can all take with us. The king's dream of creating a perfect garden, a paradise that transcended time, lived on long after his reign. It wasn't just the empire that carried the weight of his ambition. It was the very soil, the very air that had once been infused with his vision. But, as with all dreams, the passage of time slowly chipped away at the physical beauty of his creation. The gardens, once a symbol of splendor, faded into ruins. The marble fountains, once glittering with water, now lay cracked, their gentle murmurs silenced by the years. The flowers, once vivid and fragrant, had withered, leaving behind only memories of what once was. And yet, despite all this decay, the king's gardens continued to speak, though in a quieter, more subtle voice. You see, the gardens were never meant to be permanent. They were never meant to last forever. They were always meant to be a moment in time, a brief, fleeting instance of beauty that would eventually return to the earth. But perhaps that was the true genius of the king's vision. By creating something so fleeting, he understood the very nature of life itself. He knew that nothing lasts forever, not power, not beauty, and certainly not the things we create. But in that impermanence there is beauty, there is a lesson. His gardens, like life itself, were a celebration of the fleeting moments, the small but precious intervals where we can pause, reflect, and appreciate the world around us before it changes again. And here's the interesting thing about how this idea of impermanence played out. The king's gardens, though physically gone, left behind something far more powerful, an idea that spread far beyond Persia. The influence of the Persian gardens didn't just disappear with time. It was passed down, adopted and adapted by other cultures, becoming part of a broader tradition of garden design. In a sense, the king's obsession with beauty and harmony became something that transcended his own empire, spreading like seeds, carried on the wind. The idea of a garden as a place of peace, reflection, and divine connection influenced other great civilizations, including the Mughal emperors in India, who built the famous gardens of the Taj Mahal. Even in Europe, the formal gardens of the Renaissance were inspired by the principles laid out in the king's vision, and so, though the king himself was gone, his influence lived on. Let's take a step back for a moment and think about how one person's vision, one person's obsession, can ripple through time, leaving behind a legacy that outlasts even the person who created it. It's a powerful thought, isn't it? The king, in his quest to create something eternal, inadvertently showed us that the most lasting legacies aren't always the physical things we leave behind. Sometimes, it's the ideas we inspire, the dreams we plant in others, that truly endure. The gardens, though they eventually crumbled, continued to inspire artists, gardeners, and dreamers across the world, long after the king's empire had faded into history. But here's where the story takes another turn, an unexpected twist that might surprise you. Even as the physical gardens fell into ruin, the very idea of them lived on in a different form, as a symbol of hope and renewal. For many, the king's gardens came to represent not just an empire of luxury, but a world where beauty and nature could provide comfort and solace during times of hardship. The image of the garden, lush, fragrant, and serene, became a symbol of peace in turbulent times. In the chaos of the world, the gardens remained a metaphor for the calm that can exist even in the midst of destruction. And just as the king's vision transformed the gardens into something greater than their physical form, so too did his gardens become a metaphor for the human experience. We all strive to create something meaningful, something that will outlast us, even when we know, deep down, that nothing lasts forever. The king understood this in a way that many never do. He saw beauty not in perfection, but in the very imperfection of life, the way that every moment, every creation, every effort is destined to fade but still has value while it exists. As we reflect on the king's gardens, it's impossible not to see the connections to our own lives. We all create in some form, whether it's through our work, our relationships, or our passions. We pour our hearts into these creations, hoping they will last, hoping they will make a mark on the world. But like the king's gardens, our creations, too, are fleeting. They will fade, they will wither, but the beauty, the impact, the legacy they leave behind, those are the things that endure. And now, as the night deepens, let the story of the king's gardens wash over you like the soft fragrance of the flowers that once bloomed in his paradise. Let it remind you that the act of creation, the pursuit of beauty, is in itself a form of immortality. And even as things fade, even as the gardens crumble to dust, the dream remains. So, as you drift off into a peaceful sleep, think about what you are creating in your own life. What dreams are you planting in the soil of your own existence? What gardens are you building, even if only in your mind? Just like the king, we all have the power to create something beautiful, even if it's only for a fleeting moment. And maybe, just maybe, those moments are enough now. As the story fades into the quiet of the night, let the soft sounds of the garden, the gentle rustling of leaves, and the distant murmur of fountains drift through your mind, bringing you peace. As you rest, it seems that we've reached the end of the story for tonight, with the king's journey through his gardens, his legacy, and the passage of time. We've come to understand that beauty isn't just in the physical, it's in the moments we create, the fleeting experiences that shape us, even if they don't last forever. And just like that, the garden once blooming with vibrant life becomes a quiet reflection of what is eternal, the pursuit of meaning, the beauty in the process, and the impact we leave in ways we might never fully see. As you close your eyes, let these thoughts settle in your mind. The gardens may have crumbled, the king may have passed, but the lessons of growth, creation, and impermanence will continue to live on. We all have gardens within us waiting to be nurtured. So, as the night wraps you in its embrace, carry with you the king's wisdom, the truth that sometimes it's the moments that fade that leave the deepest impressions. Now, with the quiet hum of the night around you, let the softness of the garden's memory carry you into sleep, where the beauty of impermanence and creation continues in the world of dreams. The king's gardens, while fading into the mists of time, didn't just leave behind an aesthetic legacy, they became a symbol of what it means to seek the divine within the earthly. And here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. You see, as the centuries passed, the king's obsession with beauty and harmony began to take on new meanings beyond the scope of his own life and reign. The gardens became more than just the expression of a king's desires. They became a reflection of the human spirit's unyielding need for peace, balance, and connection with nature. And, interestingly enough, as the world changed, the gardens adapted to new interpretations and were seen as metaphors for the very human condition. You might be wondering how this transformation took place. Well, it wasn't immediate. It took time for the idea of the king's gardens to evolve, just as it took time for the empire itself to adapt to the changing tides of history. For years, the gardens existed as a simple reminder of a ruler's power and taste. They were a display of wealth and opulence, a living testament to the king's vision. But as time passed, the gardens began to symbolize something else entirely. They became a place where people, whether peasants or nobles, could come to find solace. They weren't just a luxury for the wealthy. They were a space where anyone could feel a sense of peace, no matter their status in life. The gardens, through their very existence, became a reminder that beauty is not exclusive, and peace is not reserved only for the privileged. In a sense, the gardens came to represent a shared human experience, the search for inner harmony amidst the chaos of the world, and that's the power of a truly great creation. The king's gardens, despite their origins in luxury, became universal. In their appeal, they transcended their royal creator and became a symbol for all of humanity. Now, here's a curious little fact you might not have expected. Even after the fall of the Persian Empire, the gardens remained a point of cultural fascination. In fact, many of the great minds and poets who followed the king's reign found inspiration in these very gardens. One of the most famous poets in history, Rumi, whose works were infused with deep spiritual wisdom, often referenced gardens in his poetry. But what's truly intriguing is that Rumi didn't just see gardens as literal spaces of beauty. He saw them as symbols of the soul's journey. The winding paths, the lush greenery, the gentle flow of water, all of these, to him, represented the human search for enlightenment and inner peace. Imagine that for a moment, how a garden, a creation born of a king's obsession with beauty and peace, could inspire some of the most profound spiritual reflections in history. And even more fascinating, Rumi's vision of the garden was not so much about the physical plants and flowers, but about the emotional and spiritual growth they represented. His gardens, much like the king's, became a metaphor for life's journey, a path full of twists and turns, where beauty and hardship coexisted. And now, let's step into a slightly different view of things. Despite the symbolism and reverence surrounding the gardens, there was always a darker side to the king's obsession. The more the king invested in perfecting his paradise, the more he seemed to withdraw from his kingdom's real needs. The empire, once rich and flourishing, began to feel the strain of his neglect. Some historians even suggest that the king's detachment from the affairs of state led to a weakening of his power, both internally and externally. In his pursuit of perfection, the king may have overlooked the needs of his people, which ultimately contributed to the empire's decline. This shift in the king's priorities, his increasing obsession with the garden, serves as a warning for us all. It's easy to get lost in the pursuit of beauty, in the chase for something ideal. But as the king's story shows, there is always a balance to be found. Too much focus on one thing can lead to neglect of others. The gardens, once a symbol of the king's greatness, slowly began to mirror his own downfall. Beautiful, yes, but fragile. And in that fragility we find a valuable lesson. Sometimes the pursuit of perfection can be blinding. It can cause us to lose sight of the very things that matter most: the people, the relationships, the connections that hold us together. However, just as his gardens fell into disrepair, the idea of them didn't perish with them. The king's legacy, his vision of paradise, lived on in the stories that were told about him, in the art that was inspired by his gardens, and in the spiritual reflections of those who came after. And this is where the real beauty of the story lies. What the king created wasn't just a physical space. He created an idea, a vision that would continue to inspire generations long after his death. Even now, thousands of years later, when we think of gardens, we are often reminded of that Persian king. His vision wasn't just about creating a beautiful space. It was about creating a space where people could connect with nature, with the divine, and with each other. That idea, the idea that beauty can bring us closer to something greater than ourselves, is one that transcends cultures, ages, and empires. And as you reflect on the gardens, think about your own creations, the things you build, the beauty you craft, and the spaces you fill. Like the king, we all have a vision, a dream of something perfect. But perhaps the real lesson is that, even in our imperfections, there is beauty. Even as time wears on, and the flowers of our efforts begin to wilt, the essence of what we created, love, the intention, the passion remains. And that, my friends, is the true legacy of the Persian king's gardens. As the story of the king and his gardens winds through the corridors of time, we're left with something much more profound than just the images of fragrant flowers and shimmering fountains. The gardens, over time, took on layers of meaning, far beyond their original design. In fact, they became a cultural treasure, one that spoke to the deepest parts of the human condition: the desire to connect with nature, to seek peace amidst chaos, and to find beauty in a world that often feels out of our control. In the king's time, the garden was an emblem of his personal triumph, his ability to shape the world around him. He wasn't just ruling a kingdom, he was ruling the earth itself, bending nature to his will. But as time passed and empires fell, the garden became something different. It became a space for reflection, for healing, and for finding solace in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. The king's vision, which had once been a luxury only for the elite, slowly transformed into something universal, a shared human experience. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Though you might be thinking that, with the king's death, the gardens would have been forgotten, left to decay in the dust of history. But that's not quite how things unfolded. What's truly fascinating is how the gardens managed to endure, not just as physical spaces but as an idea that lived on in the hearts and minds of people across generations. They continued to inspire artists, poets, and dreamers long after the king had passed. The idea of a perfect garden, a place where nature and beauty intersected in harmony, became a symbol for something greater, something transcendent. And while the king's original gardens may have crumbled over the centuries, they lived on in the art, literature, and cultural traditions that followed. The king's gardens became a metaphor for the divine connection between humans and the natural world. They weren't just a place to admire beauty, they were a place to meditate, to reflect, and to find meaning in the ever-changing cycle of life. It was as though, through his gardens, the king had tapped into a deeper understanding of the world, one that acknowledged both the fragility of existence and the potential for renewal. Let's pause and consider that for a moment. The gardens weren't just about beauty, they were about life itself, about birth, growth, decay, and rebirth. The garden, with its flowers that bloomed and withered, echoed the very cycle of life. The king's dream wasn't just to create a place of beauty. It was to create a space where the natural rhythms of life could be understood and celebrated. And even when the flowers faded, the lessons of the garden, the appreciation for nature, the acceptance of impermanence remained. And here's the fascinating part. As time passed and the world changed, the symbolism of the garden grew more complex. The once mighty Persian Empire fell, new rulers rose, and new ideas began to take root. But no matter how much the world shifted, the garden remained a symbol of something constant, something that transcended the fluctuations of history. It was a symbol of peace, of contemplation, and of the enduring human desire to create beauty even in the face of inevitable decay. The garden wasn't just a luxury of the rich, it became a universal idea, an ideal that transcended wealth and status. Here's an interesting thought. In many ways, the king's gardens, though they were designed to be a space of beauty and serenity, also became a space of inner transformation. When visitors walked through these gardens, they weren't just admiring the plants or the fountains. They were experiencing something much deeper. The gardens, with their carefully curated beauty, served as a reminder of the potential for growth within each person. As people walked through the pathways, they weren't just strolling through a physical space. They were walking through a space that represented personal growth and spiritual awakening. It's almost as if the garden became a mirror of the human soul. It was a place where people could reflect on their own lives, their own desires, and their own relationship with the world around them. And even though the king's reign had ended, even though his gardens had faded, the symbolism of the garden, that quest for peace, beauty, and inner growth remained. And in that, the king's legacy lived on. But even with all the beauty and symbolism surrounding the king's creation, there was still a question that lingered in the background. Did the king ever truly find what he was looking for? Did the gardens, in their perfection, ever offer him the peace he so desperately sought? As we look at the king's life and his gardens, we can't help but wonder if, in his pursuit of beauty, he was also searching for something deeper, a sense of connection to the world, to nature, and perhaps even to the divine. The gardens were his way of trying to achieve that connection, but in the end, it was the act of creation itself that perhaps gave him the most peace. And now, as you reflect on the king's journey and his gardens, think about your own search for meaning in life. What gardens are you creating in your own world? What spaces are you nurturing, whether physical or metaphorical, that bring you closer to peace, to beauty, and to the deeper truths of existence? Just as the king's gardens became a mirror for his soul, perhaps the spaces we create in our own lives can serve as mirrors for our own growth and transformation. As the story of the king's gardens slowly comes to a close, we are left with this enduring thought: the beauty we create, the things we build with our own hands and hearts, will one day fade. But in that impermanence, in the fleeting nature of beauty, there is a lesson. Beauty is not something to possess, it is something to experience. And in the experience, in the fleeting moments of wonder, we find meaning. The king's gardens may be gone, but the idea of them, the lesson they imparted, remains alive in the hearts of those who understand the value of creation, of beauty, and of the quiet peace that comes from connecting with nature and with ourselves. Now, as the night deepens and the story fades, may you find peace in the knowledge that, like the gardens, the beauty you create, no matter how fleeting, is part of something greater. And just like the king, we all have the ability to build our own paradise, even if only for a moment. The king's gardens, even as they fell into ruin, continued to inspire. They remained a testament not to the grandeur of his reign, but to the deeper truths he sought through the creation of such beauty. These gardens were more than mere spaces of luxury. They were representations of an inner journey, a quest for something greater than what the eye could see. It's fascinating, isn't it? How something so physical like a garden can come to symbolize something so intangible: spiritual peace, personal growth, and the eternal dance between life and death. As we move further into this story, it's important to reflect on what truly endures in the end. What is it about the king's gardens that allows them to remain in the hearts and minds of those who came after? Was it their beauty, their complexity? Or was it, perhaps, the deeper message they conveyed about the human condition? One thing that stands out in the tale of the king's gardens is the very nature of creation itself. The king's vision was built from the ground up, quite literally. He shaped the earth, moved water, and planted trees with the sole purpose of creating a perfect, harmonious space. But what happens when that space, so carefully constructed, begins to fade? What happens when the fountains crack and the flowers wither? It's easy to see decay as the end of something beautiful. But perhaps, in the case of the king's gardens, that's not the case at all. Perhaps decay is just another part of the cycle of life, a cycle that is as much a part of the garden's beauty as its bloom. What makes the king's gardens so powerful, even in their decline, is that they embody the very essence of life's impact. The flowers may have wilted, the fountains stopped flowing, but the idea of the garden, the peace it brought to its visitors, the tranquility of nature never truly disappeared. In fact, it only grew stronger. The garden, once a physical place, became a symbol. It became a part of the cultural consciousness. In every poet, artist, or philosopher who was inspired by it, the garden continued to live, in a way, forever. And speaking of inspiration, the gardens weren't just a place for personal reflection for the king. They became a place for countless others who followed in his footsteps, each person finding their own meaning in the beauty and the lessons it offered. Writers and artists from far and wide sought to capture the essence of the king's creation in their own work, often drawing on the symbolism of the garden to express their own ideas about life, love, and the passage of time. In fact, the king's gardens became a metaphor for creativity itself, a place where inspiration bloomed, where new ideas took root, and where the soul could find freedom. This brings us to an interesting point. The gardens were not just a reflection of the king's personal desires, they were a reflection of the collective human experience. Each person who visited the garden, each person who encountered its beauty, interpreted it in their own way. And in this sense, the garden became a shared experience, something that transcended the king's lifetime and became a universal symbol of human aspirations. People from all walks of life could come to the garden, see its beauty, and feel something deeply within themselves. They were not just admiring a king's creation, they were experiencing something much more personal. Let's pause here for a moment and think about that. How often do we create something in our lives that has meaning not just for us but for others as well? We all have gardens to tend, whether they are literal gardens or the projects, relationships, and dreams we nurture. And when we create, when we put our hearts into something, it's not just about leaving a mark on the world for our own benefit. It's about sharing that creation with others, allowing them to find their own meaning in it, just as the king's gardens were shared with the people who visited them. In a way, the king's gardens remind us that creation, at its best, is a collaborative experience. It's not just about the creator. It's about how others connect with that creation, how they interpret it, and how it becomes a part of their own journey. The beauty of the king's gardens wasn't just in the roses or the fountains, it was in how they made people feel, how they helped them reflect on their own lives, and how they connected them to something greater than themselves. The gardens, in all their splendor and decay, became a living, breathing entity, something that transcended time and space, something that continued to speak to those who encountered it. And as the gardens slowly faded, one thing remained certain. They had accomplished what the king had hoped for all along. They had become more than just a symbol of his reign. They had become a symbol of human aspiration, a reminder that, no matter how fleeting our creations may be, they can still have a lasting impact. The king's gardens may have withered away, but the dream that inspired them continues to live on, in the hearts and minds of all who have heard the story. As we bring this chapter to a close, let's reflect on what this story teaches us. The king's gardens were beautiful, yes, but their true beauty lay not in their perfection, but in their imperfection. The very fact that they were destined to fade made them all the more meaningful. They were a reminder that everything in life is temporary, but that doesn't mean it lacks value. It's in the fleeting moments, the ephemeral beauty, that we find some of life's most profound lessons. The king's gardens, in all their glory and decay, remind us to appreciate the present, to find beauty in the impermanent, and to continue creating, even when we know that our creations may not last forever. As you reflect on the gardens and their legacy, think about the gardens in your own life, the things you are creating, nurturing, and sharing with others. Remember that even though they may not last forever, their impact can still be profound. And just like the king, we all have the power to leave behind something beautiful, something that lives on in the hearts of others. Now, as the quiet night envelops you, take a deep breath and let go of the worries of the day. The gardens may be gone, but their spirit lives on, in the lessons they teach, in the memories they leave behind, and in the beauty we continue to create in the world around us. Now, as we move further into the story, it's time to reflect on the king's journey, not just through his gardens, but through his life and legacy. The gardens, which he once tended with such fervor, have now become a metaphor for something more than just beauty and opulence. They represent the king's search for meaning, for peace, and for something lasting in a world that is constantly shifting and changing. And while the physical space of the garden has faded over time, the essence of what the king sought still lingers in the stories, the poems, and the dreams of those who follow in his footsteps. In fact, the king's gardens have transcended their physical existence, much like the king's own reign. The gardens are no longer just about a king's wealth or his power over nature. They are a symbol of the human condition. The gardens, with their winding paths and flourishing flowers, have become a metaphor for our own journeys, our own search for peace and fulfillment in the face of an ever-changing world. But let's dig a little deeper. What was it that the king truly sought in his gardens? Was it simply beauty? Was it peace? Or was it something more, a sense of immortality, of leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after he was gone? The gardens were a way for him to leave a mark on the world, to create something that could outlast his reign and his empire. And while the physical gardens may have crumbled with time, the idea behind them, the idea of creating beauty, harmony, and connection with nature has endured. The king's quest for immortality through his gardens is a theme that resonates with many of us today. We all strive to leave something behind, to create something that will endure, even as we know that time will eventually erase everything. The king, in his obsession with his gardens, was no different from the rest of us. He sought something lasting, something that would outlive him, and in the end, it wasn't the flowers or the fountains that lasted, it was the idea of the garden itself. But what's truly remarkable about the king's journey is that, in his search for immortality, he found something deeper. The gardens, as they decayed and faded, became a reminder that beauty is not about permanence. It's about the moments we create, the experiences we share, and the connections we make along the way. The gardens were not about holding on to something forever. They were about living in the moment, appreciating the beauty of life as it is, and accepting that all things must eventually pass. In that acceptance, there is a kind of peace, and perhaps that's the greatest lesson the king's gardens offer us, the beauty of The king spent years building something that he thought would stand the test of time, but in the end, it was the very act of creation that mattered most. The gardens were not about the final product, but about the journey, the time spent planting, nurturing, and creating. The gardens became a symbol of life's fleeting nature, and in that they became eternal. As the king's gardens continued to inspire generations, they became a place not just for reflection, but for renewal. They were a place where people came to find solace in the midst of their own struggles, where they could walk the paths and reconnect with nature. The gardens became a sanctuary, a place where people could momentarily escape the chaos of the world and find peace in the simplicity of nature's beauty. And isn't that what we all seek? A place to pause, to breathe, and to remember what is truly important. Now, as we think about the king's gardens and what they represent, let's turn inward. Think about your own life. What gardens are you tending? What are you creating in your own world that will leave a mark on the lives of others? Like the king, we all have the ability to plant seeds, whether they are literal or metaphorical, will grow into something beautiful. It may not last forever, but it will have its moment. And in that moment, it will matter as you think about the legacy you want to leave behind. Remember the lesson of the king's gardens, that beauty is not about permanence. It's about the moments we create, the love we share, and the connections we make along the way. The king may have sought immortality through his gardens, but in the end, it was the beauty of the journey, the time spent nurturing and creating, that left its mark on the world. And as the night settles in around you, take a moment to reflect on your own gardens, your own creations, and appreciate the beauty in their impermanence. Just as the king found peace in the fading of his gardens, so too can we find peace in the fleeting moments of our own lives. The gardens may wither, the flowers may fall, but the love and care we put into them will always endure. Now, as you rest, let the peace of the king's gardens wash over you. Let it remind you that, even in the face of impermanence, there is beauty, there is meaning, and there is love. The king's gardens, having been both his greatest creation and his most profound legacy, now exist in a space between reality and myth. Time, as it always does, eroded their physical form, but it could never erase the essence they represented. The king's vision of paradise, once etched into the very landscape of his kingdom, now floats in the memories of those who witnessed it and in the legends that carried his story through the centuries. And this is where the true power of his gardens lies, beyond the roses, the fountains, and the exotic plants. Beyond the marble paths and the cool running water, his creation became a symbol of something more. It was not just a testament to his wealth or his love for nature. No, it was a deeper symbol, one that resonated with the human spirit, something that speaks to us still today. In the world of rulers and empires, we often look to the grand monuments of power, the towering palaces, the imposing statues, the city walls. These structures are made to last, to declare the ruler's place in history. But what sets the king's gardens apart is that they weren't built solely for permanence. They were built for beauty, for peace, and for the connection between humanity and the natural world. They were a reflection of a different kind of power, the power to create, to nurture, and to reflect on the mysteries of life. Perhaps then, the gardens are not just a symbol of the king's reign, but a reminder of the transient nature of all things. They are not meant to stand forever. In fact, their very impermanence makes them even more powerful. The king may have tried to capture the essence of eternity, but in the end, it was the fleeting nature of his creation that made it eternal. The gardens lived not in their physical state, but in their ability to inspire, to move, and to transform the souls of those who walked through them. Now, as you think about the king's legacy, consider this. We are all, in a way, gardeners of our own lives. We plant seeds, we nurture them, and we tend to the gardens of our relationships, our passions, and our dreams. But like the king's gardens, our creations may not last forever. They will change, they will grow, and they will eventually fade. But in that process there is beauty. There is meaning in every moment of growth, in every bloom, and in every moment of decay. The king's gardens were a reflection of life itself, an ever-changing, ever-evolving journey. And in this way, they invite us to look at our own lives through a different lens. Instead of focusing solely on the end result, perhaps we should focus on the process, the moments we spend creating, nurturing, and cultivating. Because in the end, it is the effort, the journey, and the beauty of each passing season that defines the true essence of our own gardens. What are you nurturing in your life right now? What seeds have you planted that are waiting to bloom? Like the king, we all have the ability to create something meaningful, even if that creation is fleeting. The gardens he built may have been temporary, but the joy, the peace, and the connection they brought to those who visited them are eternal. Let's take a moment to reflect on the fleeting beauty of life and the gardens we are creating in our own hearts and minds. As the king's gardens began to fade with time, so to do our moments in the sun. But that does not make them any less valuable. What matters is the love we put into our gardens, the care we take in tending to them, and the impact they leave on the world. The gardens may fade, but the lessons they teach us about life, beauty, and the passing of time remain with us. As you rest tonight, think about your own gardens. What are you cultivating? How can you nurture your own life's beauty, even in the face of impermanence? The king's gardens, though now a part of history, remind us that the true beauty lies not in their preservation, but in the moments we share, the lives we touch, and the love we plant in the world. Now, as the night deepens, let the quiet of the evening wrap around you, like the soft rustling of leaves in a garden. Let the peace of the king's creation linger in your mind, reminding you that even in the face of life's inevitable changes, there is beauty in the journey, and that is what makes it all worthwhile. As the story of the king's gardens continues to unfold, we find ourselves at a crossroads, a place where the past and the present meet, where the legacy of the king lives on in the quiet spaces we create within our own lives. The gardens, though long gone in their physical form, remain alive in the stories we tell, in the ways we connect with nature, and in the dreams we nurture. And it is in this moment, in this pause between the fading of the old and the birth of the new, that we find the real lesson of the king's life. You see, the gardens were not just an act of creation, they were an act of connection. The king's ability to shape the land, to create a space where nature and human artistry could coexist, spoke to a deeper truth, a truth that resonates with us today. The gardens weren't just a display of wealth or power, they were a testament to the king's desire to connect with something larger than himself. His gardens were a reflection of his yearning to touch the divine, to find peace in a world that was often filled with turmoil and uncertainty. In a way, the gardens were his way of reaching out into the vastness of the universe, trying to understand the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth. And in this pursuit, the king created something far more enduring than a physical structure. He created a space for reflection, for spiritual growth, and for emotional renewal. The gardens were not just a place for the body to wander. They were a place for the soul to rest. It was here, among the flowers and fountains, that the king and those who visited could find solace in the midst of life's chaos. The gardens, then, were not just an escape from the world, they were a means of engaging with it on a deeper level. But what happens when the gardens begin to fade? When the flowers no longer bloom and the fountains no longer flow? The king's gardens, though they may have withered with time, remind us that even in the face of decay, there is beauty. The gardens, in their imperfection, still offer us something precious, a reminder that life, in all its fleeting moments, is worth living. And as the seasons pass, as the petals fall and the leaves turn to dust, we are reminded of the cyclical nature of existence. The gardens, once vibrant and full of life, now exist only in memory, but in those memories, they continue to shape us. This is the true power of the king's legacy, not in the physical remnants of his gardens, but in the way they continue to inspire. The gardens became a symbol of resilience, of beauty and imperfection, and of the eternal dance between life and death. As we reflect on the gardens, we are reminded that the things we create, the spaces we nurture, and the relationships we build are not meant to last forever. What matters is how we live within them, how we embrace the fleeting moments, and how we make the most of the time we have now. Think about your own life. What gardens are you cultivating in your world? What spaces are you creating for yourself and for others to find peace, to reflect, and to grow? Like the king, we all have the power to create something beautiful even if it doesn't last forever. The gardens we build, whether in our hearts or in our communities, have the potential to touch the lives of those around us, just as the king's gardens once touched the lives of his people. As you drift off into sleep tonight, take with you the lessons of the gardens, the beauty in imperfection, the power of creation, and the reminder that the things we build, no matter how temporary, are still worth creating. Like the king, we too can find meaning in the things we cultivate, in the spaces we shape, and in the moments we spend nurturing what is important to us. So, as the night surrounds you and the story of the king fades into the quiet, remember that the gardens we create, though they may wither, will never truly be gone. Their impact lives on in the people we touch, in the beauty we share, and in the love we leave behind. As we move deeper into the story, there is one final reflection: we must consider the lasting power of the king's gardens, even in their decline, and what that teaches us about the nature of creation, legacy, and the passage of time. For much of the story, we've focused on the beauty the king sought to build, and the peace his gardens brought to those who experienced them. But what happens when everything begins to fade? When the marble fountains crack, the flowers wither, and the once vibrant colors of the garden begin to dull? Perhaps the most profound lesson the king's gardens offer us is this: that beauty is not confined to the physical form, but rather, it resides in the moments we spend nurturing what we love. It's in the process, the planting, the tending, the growing, that true beauty is realized. The king's gardens weren't meant to last forever, but they still left an indelible mark on the world. Even as they decayed, they became a symbol of something that is much more enduring than any structure or monument: the power of creation and the impact we have on others through the things we build, however temporary they may seem. Think about that for a moment. How often do we find ourselves obsessed with the idea of creating something that lasts, something that stands the test of time? The king wanted his gardens to be eternal, but in his desire to create permanence, he discovered that true immortality lies not in the preservation of physical things, but in the impact those things have on others. The gardens became a living symbol of beauty, a reminder that while life may be fleeting, what we create can resonate long after we are gone. The legacy of the king's gardens, then, is not found in their enduring beauty, but in the stories, the lessons, and the reflections they inspire. The gardens became a metaphor for something larger than the king himself, an idea that transcends the constraints of time, a symbol of the way beauty can evolve, fade, and be reborn again. It's this cycle of creation and decay that gives the gardens their power. They are a testament to the human experience, the desire to create, to build, and to leave something behind, even knowing that all things must eventually come to an end. Now, think about your own creations. What are you building in your own life? What gardens are you nurturing, even if you know they won't last forever? Perhaps the true power of your work doesn't lie in how long it endures, but in the moments it brings to life, in the connections it fosters, and in the beauty it creates while it exists. The king, with all his power and wealth, understood this. His gardens were not meant to be perfect, eternal displays of splendor. They were meant to be lived in, to be experienced in, to bring peace to those who wandered through them. In that, the gardens fulfilled their purpose, and so too does our own work, no matter how fleeting it may seem. The king's gardens also remind us of the importance of balance. As the king dedicated more and more of his energy to creating his perfect paradise, he lost sight of the other aspects of his kingdom: the people, the empire, the very forces that sustained his reign. The lesson here is clear: while creation is important, it must not come at the expense of the world around us. There must be a balance between creation and stewardship, between passion and responsibility. The king, in his pursuit of perfection, he became too absorbed in his gardens, neglecting the needs of his people. But even in that mistake, there is a lesson for us. We must learn to balance the things we create with the needs of those we love, the responsibilities we carry, and the world we inhabit. As we continue through this journey, we can't help but reflect on the ways in which the king's gardens live on today, not just in the physical remnants of their beauty, but in the spirit of what they represented. These gardens were more than a luxury. They were an invitation to connect with nature, to create beauty, and to find peace in a chaotic world. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of the king's legacy, that through the act of creation he brought peace, reflection, and joy to countless people long after the flowers had faded and the fountains had stopped flowing. The gardens are, in the end, a reminder that beauty and legacy are not defined by permanence. They are defined by the impact we make in the lives of others, by the moments we share, and by the things we create, no matter how brief their existence may be. That king's gardens may no longer exist in the form he intended, but their spirit lives on in the stories we tell, in the spaces we create, and in the beauty we continue to share with the world. So as you lie back tonight, let the idea of the king's gardens linger in your mind. Reflect on the creations in your own life, the seeds you are planting, and the beauty you are nurturing. Remember that even if your gardens don't last forever, the joy they bring in the moment is what truly matters. The king may have sought immortality, but what he discovered in his gardens was something even more profound: that the beauty of life lies in its fleeting moments, and that is what gives it meaning. As the king's gardens continued to be a source of inspiration, even long after their physical decay, it became clear that the true legacy of these gardens wasn't just the flowers, trees, or the fountains. No, the true power of the king's creation lay in what the gardens represented: the king's attempt to bring something divine into the earthly realm. In his gardens, the king tried to find harmony between nature and the human spirit. to create a space where peace, beauty, and reflection could thrive side by side. But as we all know, even the most beautiful creations are not immune to time's effects. The gardens, with all their grandeur, eventually withered and faded, much like the king himself. Yet in their decay, there was still something meaningful. The gardens became a living metaphor for the king's reign, for life itself, reminding us that even in our decline, there is beauty. Even in our fading, we have the power to leave something lasting, something that will continue to resonate, inspire, and guide others. And in that respect, the gardens were not just a symbol of impermanence, they were a symbol of resilience. They were a testament to the strength of human creativity, the way that we, as individuals, continue to build, create, and shape the world around us, even when we know that everything is temporary. The king's gardens, in their quiet fading, still spoke to those who wandered through them. They still offered a space to think, to reflect, and to find peace in the midst of life's inevitable changes. But what about the king himself? What can we learn from the life he lived, from the gardens he built, and from the legacy he left behind? The king's story is one of ambition, creation, and reflection. It's a story of a man who sought perfection, but found something deeper in the act of creating. He learned that beauty is not about permanence, it's about the moments we create, the connections we foster, and the way we live within the spaces we make. As we consider the king's life in his gardens, we are reminded that our own creations, our own gardens, will not last forever. But that doesn't make them any less meaningful. What we create, whether it's a garden, a relationship, a piece of art, or even a small moment of kindness, leaves a mark on the world. And in that mark, we find a kind of immortality, not in the things we leave behind, but in the impact we have on others. As the king's gardens faded into history, their spirit lived on in the stories people told. They lived on in the ways those who had visited them remembered the peace they found there, and in the beauty they had experienced. The gardens may no longer stand as they once did, but their essence remains, carried forward in the hearts of those who understand the deeper meaning of creation and that is the ultimate lesson of the king's gardens. Beauty is not about holding on to what we create, but about embracing the fleeting nature of life and finding peace in that understanding. Now, as we reflect on the king's legacy, let us think about our own gardens, those things we are building, nurturing, and creating. Like the king, we may have dreams and ambitions for our creations, but let us remember that the true value of our work lies not in its longevity, but in the beauty it brings in the present moment. The king's gardens, though fading, continue to inspire and teach us that beauty can be found in the temporary, in the impermanent, and in the fleeting moments that make life worth living. So, as you prepare to rest tonight, think about the gardens in your own life. What are you creating? What are you nurturing? And, most importantly, how are you embracing the beauty of the moment? Knowing that all things, like the king's gardens, are transient. In that acceptance, we find peace. And in that peace, we discover the true beauty of life. As we come to the final chapter of the king's story, it's time to reflect on everything that has been shared on the gardens, on the king's journey, and on the lessons we can draw from his life. The gardens, now lost to time, were once a place of extraordinary beauty, a symbol of the king's ambition and vision. But as they faded, they left behind something far more lasting than mere stone or foliage. They left behind a legacy of inspiration, a reminder that beauty, peace, and connection are the true treasures in life. The gardens became more than just a physical space. They became a symbol of the human spirit's quest for meaning, for connection, and for the divine. The king, in his search for immortality, understood something that many of us forget, that immortality doesn't lie in the preservation of our creations, but in the impact those creations have on others. His gardens, which he carefully nurtured and tended, may not have lasted forever, but their influence did. They inspired poets, artists, and dreamers across generations, each one finding their own meaning in the king's vision. The gardens were not just a reflection of the king's wealth and power, they were a reflection of his desire to connect with something greater than himself, to create a space where beauty and nature could exist in perfect harmony. And as we consider the king's legacy, we are reminded that our own creations, too, have the potential to leave a lasting impact. Like the king, we all have the ability to create beauty, to nurture the world around us, and to build something meaningful. It may not last forever. It may fade, change, and evolve. But in the process of creation, in the moments of growth and reflection, there is something that endures. It is the love, the care, and the intention we put into what we create that leaves its mark. But perhaps the most profound lesson we can learn from the king's gardens is this: beauty is not defined by permanence. It is defined by the experience, by the emotions it stirs, and by the connections it fosters. The king sought to create a perfect garden that would stand the test of time, but in doing so, he discovered that the beauty of the garden lay not in its ability to endure, but in its ability to inspire, to evoke peace, and to connect people with the natural world. As the gardens faded and the king's empire crumbled, the essence of what he created lived on not in the flowers or fountains, but in the hearts of those who experienced them. The gardens became a part of the collective memory, a symbol of the beauty that can exist in fleeting moments. and a reminder that we don't need to hold on to things forever to make them meaningful. The king's gardens may have withered, but their spirit remains, carried forward in the stories we tell, the lessons we learn, and the beauty we continue to create. And now, as the story of the king's gardens comes to an end, it's time to reflect on your own life. What gardens are you creating? What beauty are you nurturing? It's easy to get caught up in the idea that everything we build must last forever, that our creations must stand the test of time. But the king's story teaches us that it's not the longevity of our creations that matters. What matters is the beauty they bring to the world, the peace they inspire, and the connections they foster in the moments we share. As the night settles in around you, remember the king's gardens, beautiful, fleeting, and yet timeless in their influence. They remind us that the true beauty of life lies in the moments we create, the connections we make, and the love we share. Even in the face of impermanence, there is beauty. Even in the passage of time, there is meaning. Now, as you drift off into a peaceful sleep, let the lessons of the gardens linger in your heart. Embrace the fleeting beauty of life. And remember that what you create, whether it lasts for a moment or a lifetime, will always leave its mark. End of script. Sweet dreams.